Now, where did this come from? I mean, was this just, was Jefferson drunk one day and he said, hey, I got a great one for you. We'll just nullify all the laws. No, it turns out that these ideas go back years. Jefferson didn't just make this up out of nowhere. If you look at the convention, the Virginia Ratifying Convention, in which Virginia decided whether or not it wanted to ratify the Constitution, if you look at that event, you see that the Federalists, the ones who support the Constitution, are responding to their anti-Federalist critics by assuring them the federal government will have only those powers that are expressly delegated. They use the word expressly, by the way. So don't worry about it. Don't worry about the general welfare clause or anything like that. The federal government has only the powers expressly delegated to it. And the five-man committee, whose job it was to draft the instrument of ratification for Virginia, included George Nicholas, who became the Attorney General for Kentucky, Edmund Randolph, who became later U.S. Attorney General and was Governor of Virginia, and they, great supporters of the Constitution, they said Virginia will be exonerated from it if the federal government should go beyond its powers. So already in 1790, Alexander Hamilton is already up to his tricks, and Patrick Henry in Virginia is saying, whoa, 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 wait a minute, this is unconstitutional, and we were assured when we ratified this document that we would be exonerated if this government should exceed its powers. And so Patrick Henry used the language of these assurances from the ratifying convention, drafted a resolution, and got it through the legislature of Virginia. As the 1790s moved on, Thomas Jefferson's friend John Taylor of Caroline wrote a series of pamphlets and letters and pieces in which he argued that the state governments ought to watch carefully for unconstitutional federal legislation. So by the time Jefferson writes the Kentucky Resolutions in 1798, this is sort of old hat, like everybody sort of knows this, that of course the states aren't required to just sit back and be lectured to by a government they themselves created. They have to have a say. If you enter into a contract with somebody, you would never, ever would you say that the other party in the contract can exclusively interpret what it means. You'll let the other person interpret what it means. I mean, could you imagine somebody signing, like in my case, like a publishing contract, but I say that only the publisher gets to really interpret what the contract means. So the contract says we'll pay you X dollars, but then maybe they'll interpret it to mean we'll pay you X dollars in the year 3000 or something. So obviously if only one party to a contract gets to interpret it, it's going to interpret it in its own favor. So this is what Jefferson is telling us about. Now, it's true that in 1798, 1799, the New England states are just appalled by these ideas. And these ideas came up, by the way, because of the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798, which the New England states supported. And among other things, the Sedition Act made it a crime punishable by fines or imprisonment to criticize the government, but particularly the President and the Congress, in such a way as to call the government into disrepute. Now notice it doesn't include Thomas Jefferson. It doesn't include the Vice President. Thomas Jefferson was the Vice President at that time. You could criticize him all you want under the Sedition Act. It was fine. So this was clearly, it was in large part a partisan move. And so Virginia and Kentucky were saying, wait a minute, this is obviously a violation of the Constitution. We have to resist. And the New England states said, oh, this is terrible. You're violating a federal law. How dare you? And then 10 years later, the New England states are doing exactly the same thing. It depends on whose ox is being gored. Because in the early part of the 19th century, New England was suffering under an embargo that it believed to be unconstitutional. So what did New England start talking about? Well, the principles of 1798 and nullification and resisting the federal government. Oh, isn't that something? Isn't that something? All through the early 19th century, we hear this language being used by New England. We hear it throughout American history. In fact, in the years just leading up to the War of 1812, Jonathan Trumbull, who was a governor of Connecticut at the time, said, whenever our national legislature is led to overleap the prescribed bounds of their constitutional powers, on the state legislatures in great emergencies devolves the arduous task. It is their right, it becomes their duty, to interpose their protecting shield between the right and liberty of the people and the assumed power of the general government. Well, this was not uncommon. Plenty of governors spoke this way. Plenty of state legislatures spoke this way. Daniel Webster, who was a U.S. Senator and before that a member of the House of Representatives from Massachusetts, who was very much a nationalist, nevertheless, when it was rumored that there might be conscription, military conscription, carried out by the federal government during the War of 1812, what did Webster say the states ought to do? He said, if this law should pass, which he believed to be unconstitutional, it would be the solemn duty of the state governments to interpose between their citizens and arbitrary power. The state governments should stand between the unconstitutional law and their people. That is the principle of interposition or nullification. In the 1820s, the Ohio legislature voted 59-7 to affirm the principles of 1798. And this goes on and on and on. Now, I don't know about you, but I didn't learn this in school. Nobody taught me this. I didn't get anything about this. And yet, somehow, even though none of us learned this in school, it's back. It's back. People are using these ideas. And so the Real ID Act, the federal government's Real ID Act, which is putting us on the road to a national ID card, has in effect been nullified by 24 states. So the federal government just more or less gave up trying to enforce it. It was impossible. We have firearms freedom acts that are making clear that the states are not going to allow the enforcement of unconstitutional infringements on the right to bear arms. And there are all different issues in which these principles are today beginning to be applied. There's a movement, Bring the Guard Home, to try to restore power over the National Guard to the governors of the states. Or even health care. We got people standing up saying, we're going to nullify this unconstitutional monstrosity. Now, I believe it's tomorrow in Texas, there's a nullification rally going on, urging the governor to preside over the nullification of unconstitutional federal legislation. That ought to keep him busy through the rest of his term, right? There are Facebook groups all over the place. I think at least 49 states have specifically a Facebook group, nullification of unconstitutional federal laws. There's a national group. It's everywhere. I am just stunned at this. And of course, just like talking about the Fed and wanting to look more at the Fed is something we're not supposed to do, we're supposed to stick to the playbook that the New York Times gives us. You know, you can talk about this issue and that issue, not these. Well, we drove them crazy by talking about the Fed. Now we're doing this. We're really not supposed to be doing this. We're supposed to just sit back and take it when the PhDs from Harvard in Washington tell us what's good for us. And yet, you know what? We're not. It's amazing to me that there are people doing this. Now, what we're supposed to do, if you ask the New York Times, you know, what would be allowable for us in the political opposition? What would you say we're allowed to do? You know, well, they would say, well, you know, keep signing petitions and writing letters and whatever. And, you know, in other words, strategies that have borne exactly zero fruits for us for like a century, we're supposed to stick to that. Why should we want to follow the lame playbook that the New York Times and Newsweek hand us? If there's one thing they hate, it's an uppity population that won't just sit back and follow the playbook of the New York Times. Now, I keep mentioning New York Times, and this is not entirely self-referential, but I will mention that the New York Times 5 years ago reviewed my book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to American History, and you'll be surprised to know they really didn't care for it, that book. But the beauty was, of course, when they attacked, they didn't just review it in the book review section, they reviewed it in a signed editorial on the editorial page, with the result, of course, being, what do we think the result of that was? Massive increase in sales, right? Because normal Americans thought, hey, you know, what's got the New York Times all ticked off? But when they reviewed it, they talked about the fact that I was talking about state nullification, and of course, being our betters, New York Times writers don't need to explain to us why we're wrong. We're just not allowed to talk about certain issues. So they didn't bother to explain why my constitutional case was wrong, or even mention that Thomas Jefferson, rather than Thomas Woods, came up with the idea. No. It's just crazy because the New York Times tells you so. Well, look, folks, you know, if we do this, if we carry this out in the States, we're going to get attacked, we're going to get slimed. But one of the beautiful things about living in the 21st century is that now that we see the financial condition of the New York Times, we realized we could be on the cusp of a world without the New York Times.